Let's look at an overview of the types of variables that we can encounter when we're doing research. Now, this is coming from page 61 of the textbook Research Methods and Survey Applications. So if you have the textbook, you can take notes in there. But the layout of this PowerPoint is going to be a little different. So let's start off, supposing that we are doing a study on perceived organizational support, and we have hypothesized that perceived organizational support will be positively correlated with organizational commitment. So we have two main variables here. We have perceived organizational support, and I should put a hyphen in there. Perceived organizational support is how much a person perceives that an organization supports them. How much the supervisor does, how much the policies do. The overall organization is perceived to support people or not support people, or somewhere in between. And so that's called perceived organizational support. And then organizational commitment is how committed a person is to an organization. Now, this hypothesis is a pretty simple hypothesis, and you can be pretty sure that it's going to be true, that the more support somebody gets from an organization, the more they're going to be committed to it, in general. Now, this hypothesis is a one-tailed hypothesis. We said the perceived organizational support will be positively correlated with organizational commitment. So we put the independent variable over here, that which can be controlled, the organizational support. The manager, the company executives can control how much support people get. And the dependent variable, or the outcome variable, is the organizational commitment of the individual. And so it depends in this model on perceived organizational support. Now, a couple things to notice is that we made a one-tailed hypothesis. It's positively correlated with organizational support. So we are predicting that this line represents a positive correlation, somewhere between 0 and 1. Now, we could have put a plus sign by this to indicate that it was a directional hypothesis. Now, furthermore, this is a causal model. We're not describing everything that happens in an organization. We're just looking at two variables, and we're just looking at one direction of causation. In real life, things are super complicated. People that are more committed to the organization, they might actually receive more organizational support from the people that work for them. Or they might be more willing to perceive the organizational support that exists. So in real life, there's going to be an arrow going that direction too. But in this model, we're just studying, and we're going to say that this arrow going towards organizational commitment is probably the biggest factor that defines the two relationships between them. So this is a simple way of representing a model with two variables, an independent variable and a dependent variable. Now, sometimes we need to take into consideration what we call control variables. If we collect data from all kinds of employees and we ask them how much support do they perceive and how committed to the organization they are, even if everybody had the exact same supervisor in the exact same organization, we would find a positive correlation, even if there was no variation in organizational support or what the organization was doing, because of the personality of the people taking it. Suppose we have two employees that work for the same boss in the same organization. We've got Happy Harry, who's just so excited about things and so positive and upbeat. And then we've got Debbie Downer, and things are not going well for her, and they never have been, and they never will. If we give them the exact same survey about their organizational support, they receive the same amount, Happy Harry is going to say, yeah, the organizational support is great here. Debbie Downer is going to say, it could be worse. I won't strongly disagree. I'll just disagree with the idea that I receive organizational support. And then the same thing with the organizational commitment. Happy Harry says, yes, I am so enthusiastic. I'm so committed about our organization. And Debbie Downer says, there's probably worse places to work, and I'll probably look for them. I don't know. I don't think I want to stay here very long. And so, due to the different personalities of the people, we're going to get these spurious correlations, even if they're in the exact same situation. So, how can we do a survey and get legitimate information? We can control for things. We can control for people's personalities. And the way that we do this in organizational psychology often is we control for positive affect. That's what Happy Harry has a lot of. And then negative affect, that's what Debbie Downer has a lot of. And there's some people have both a lot of positive and negative, and they might tend to be a little bipolar. But they're two separate variables, and we can basically ask people how often are they happy and how often are they sad. And it's called positive affect and negative affect. And there's a positive affect and negative affect scale called the PANAS, positive affect, negative affect scale, that's often used in organizational commitment to control for the personalities of the people involved. Now, it's interesting relating that to the big five, because the positive affect is typically associated with extroversion. People who are real extroverted tend to be positive and upbeat and get happy about all kinds of things. And then neuroticism tends to be associated with anger and sadness and all kinds of negative affect. So that's how positive affect and negative affect tend to relate to the big five personality traits. So, if we want to find out if the perceived organizational support really does predict organizational commitment, and it's not just due to people's personalities, we can control for positive affect and negative affect. And so in this case, we're controlling for what's known as common method bias. We're giving a survey to people, and the biases that people bring to the survey, they're going to apply to perceived organizational support, and they're going to apply it to organizational commitment. Sometimes this is called the common source error. When we get our source from the same person, their biases, their errors in perception are going to be similar for all of the variables. So controlling for positive affect and negative affect is a good way of doing it. Now, we can control for all kinds of things too. Sometimes variables are related to other things. Suppose that we wanted to do a study on eggplant quiche. And I come up with the hypothesis that eggplant quiche causes people to be short. That's negatively correlated with their height, and that it's deadly because of that, because it causes people to be short. I go out and I collect a lot of data on people, how much eggplant quiche they eat and how tall they are. And I collect that data, and sure enough, I'm going to find out that there's a lot more short people that eat eggplant quiche than tall people. There's going to be a negative correlation. And so I can conclude that eggplant quiche causes people to be short. But that's completely nonsense, because eggplant quiche is a very feminine dish in our culture. Men would hardly ever order eggplant quiche at a restaurant, but from a woman's point of view, that's a good dish to get. So I would need to control for gender to find out if there was any relationship between eggplant quiche and height. And if I controlled for gender, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't find any relationship. The only reason that eggplant quiche eaters are shorter than non-eggplant quiche eaters is because of the gender influence. So a lot of times we want to control for gender effects if one of the variables is going to be affected by some sort of gender or any other demographics. Controlling for age and education and gender are some of the most common things that we control for. Those are some of the most common control variables. So the studies that you're preparing may or may not have control variables, or you might make the hypothesis and see if they still hold up if you control for control variables. And the way we do this is through a regression analysis. We don't just test to see if this is correlated. We do multiple regression and put all three variables in as predictor variables to see if they predict organizational commitment and find out which of the three are significant. Now, there's also what's known as extraneous variables. And extraneous variables are essentially variables that should have been control variables, but we didn't measure them, so we can't actually control for them. So look at our relationship between perceived organizational support and organizational commitment. If we collect data on it, it's possible we might get a negative correlation. What might be happening there? Suppose if the salaries in one division are really lame, that they're below market value, and that people don't know why they're staying there. But if supervisors in that division were especially trained to provide support, the perceived organizational support might be really, really high in that division, even though the salaries are lame and the organizational commitment is low. So there might be a negative correlation between perceived organizational support and organizational commitment unless we control for which division. Are they in the bad division? Yes equals 1, 0 equals no. If we control for that, we would be able to take into consideration the effect of that pay structure that it has on organizational commitment, and we would most likely find out that the perceived organizational support was positively committed with organizational commitment. But if we don't measure what division they're in, it's going to be an extraneous variable, and it can mess up our study. Now let's look at a moderating variable, the phenomena of moderation. So our main hypothesis is that perceived organizational support will be positively correlated with organizational commitment. So as perceived organizational support goes up, organizational commitment goes up. But we're going to predict the second hypothesis, that this relationship will be moderated by work engagement or be changed. Now, what is work engagement? Work engagement is how engaging you find your work. It's basically how fun do you think the work is. But we don't use the word fun because that doesn't sound too serious. We talk about work engagement. And it's one of the hottest topics in organizational psychology right now, because work engagement, having fun, doing your job, people that really enjoy their job perform really well. And there's just a lot of positive things associated with work engagement. And this work engagement can change the relationship between organizational support and organizational commitment. Normally, this main relationship is pretty strong. But suppose you just absolutely love your job. It's the best job in the world. And you're really committed to it. That's kind of how I feel about my job. I love teaching. I love research. I love working with students. This is the best job in the world. I find it really, really fun. I've got super high engagement, work engagement. Now, does it matter to me how much organizational support I get from my supervisor? No, not really. I love what I'm doing. So, for people that have high work engagement, who just really love the work and have a lot of fun, the perceived organizational support, the relationship between perceived organizational support and organizational commitment will be a lot lower than for a normal person. Or if you really hate your job, that perceived organizational support might be everything, and the relationship is even stronger. So work engagement is called a moderating variable or a moderator. Moderate means to change. So it changes the strength of the relationship. When work engagement is high, the correlation is smaller, it's weaker. When work engagement is low, the correlation is going to be stronger. And perceived organizational support will have even a greater influence on organizational commitment. So this is a moderating variable, and we would enter that into our model with a second hypothesis that this relationship will be moderated by work engagement. Now let's look at a mediation model. A mediating variable, mediation or mediating means in the middle. It explains if A causes B, the mediators in the middle explains why. And so in this model, we know that perceived organizational support causes organizational commitment. And why is that? It's mediated by a sense of belonging. You feel like you should be there. When you get a lot of support, you get this sense of belonging, and then that sense of belonging makes you feel committed to the organization. Now, the way that we can represent mediation is by, we've got the original relationship here with this dotted line, but if we've got a mediator, we've got a strong correlation between perceived organizational support and sense of belonging. And then and a strong relationship between sense of belonging and organizational commitment, even when we put both perceived organizational support and sense of belonging into the regression analysis. And so that's why this is represented by a dotted line that's hardly there anymore, because this relationship will be strong, this relationship will be strong. And if perceived organizational support is completely mediated by a sense of belonging, this relationship will be close to zero. It'll no longer be significant. So if this was like 0.4 without the sense of belonging in there, and R equals 0.4, when we put since we make this model and we do the regression analysis, this relationship might be pretty high, like B equals or beta equals 0.4. This one, the coefficient would go down close to zero. The correlation would go down close to zero if it's completely mediating. Now, sometimes both this line and this line are still significant, and that's called partial mediation. So mediation, we use mediation to test why something is happening. We've got perceived organizational support, we've got organizational commitment. Why are they related? And a mediator is a sense of belonging that is created by perceived organizational support, which causes organizational commitment. So that's a mediating variable. Now, the last type of variable I want to look at is a multidimensional variable. And let's take the example of organizational commitment. We've been talking about organizational commitment in this model, but the most common model of organizational commitment used in org psych is Allen and Meyer's threefold model, where there's 3 dimensions of commitment. There's effective commitment, how much people like the organization, like that's kind of affective or emotional. There's also the continuance commitment, the cost of changing orgs, like, oh, I won't be vested in my retirement if I quit. I better stay committed to this organization until I get vested. Or I will never get such good pay given my skill level. So they're committed to the organization. That's called continuance commitment. And then there's normative commitment, and that's a sense of obligation to stay in the organization. The idea that this is the right thing for me to be doing. This is where I belong. This is my duty. The boss hired me 22 years ago when nobody saw any hope in me, and I am committed to staying to this organization because they've done something good to me. So that's normative commitment. So these are three different dimensions of organizational commitment, and typically there's like 7 or 8 questions for each of them, and you add them all together to get total organizational commitment. But we don't have to use all three dimensions. We could use just effective commitment. And in fact, a lot of studies just look at effective organizational commitment because that tends to be the most powerful one in most people, how much they like the organization. And this one has the best predictive power for predicting whether people stay or not. So, but we can use all three, and sometimes they predict things differently. And so these would be 3 dimensions of the variable organizational commitment, each of which can be treated as a separate variable, 3 different dimensions of the construct we're looking at, or they can be treated as put all together combined into the one organizational commitment variable.